Hello. On behalf of the Society of International Economic Law and Bocconi University, we are delighted to welcome you to the Society's 7th Biennial Global Conference. We had hoped to meet you last year on the campus of Bocconi University in Milan, but sadly the COVID-19 pandemic, which has affected so many of us in various ways, meant that the conference had to be postponed and reimagined as a virtual conference. The broad theme of this year's conference is Rethinking Global Economic Governance. That theme invites us to reflect and debate on the future design of international economic relations, the rules and institutions that have governed international economic law since the end of World War II, the reform of those rules and institutions, and the widening of the discipline of international economic law. The challenges arising out of the COVID-19 pandemic are at the intersection of many of these issues, and therefore they feature prominently in the conference program. The theme of the conference also calls for reflection on the importance of the role of lawyers and the rule of law in international economic relations, and on the need for trade and investment lawyers to increasingly reinvent themselves as experts in digital trade, green trade, labor rights, just to give a few examples. In designing the program for this conference, we were united in a common purpose of providing a forum for scholars, practitioners, government officials, and students to debate the reshaping of international economic law. Now, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, that debate will take a virtual form this year. Although we miss meeting you today in Milan, that new format has nonetheless enabled us to attract a more diverse group of speakers and delegates, and overall will make the conference a more inclusive forum for debate. In planning for future biennial global conferences of the Society, we will keep in mind the lessons learned from this experience and hope to develop a hybrid format for the future. So Markus, what is on offer during the next few days?
Thanks, Isabelle, and a warm welcome from myself as well. So during this virtual conference, we tried to take advantage of this new format, which we believe, stay with us in some form, as Isabelle just said, in the future, while retaining what makes conferences in general and SEAL conferences in particular, we think, special. We have a number of keynote events and roundtables. We have 28 panels, poster sessions, networking opportunities throughout the next 3 days. And we understand that not everyone will be able to stay for the duration of the entire conference. But we hope that you will find SEAL 2021 an inspiring conference with plenty of food for thought going forward. If you look through the program, which you find on the conference platform and on the SEAL website, you will find themes that are familiar, but also topics of more recent vintage. Our roundtables and panels feature topics as diverse as climate change in general, the carbon border adjustment debate in particular, global minimum tax initiative, which is currently or recently come to the fore and is currently underway. Questions of international economic governance at the multilateral, regional, individual country levels, the role of emerging technologies in trade and investment, the role of lawyers, Isabelle alluded to this, the role women play in trade and investment agreements, just to name a few, and obviously COVID, almost by default, plays an important role in this conference in many of the events we're holding. We would be remiss also not to mention our Robert Udek lecture, which will feature Professor Mary Footer, who will speak on people, place, and time as determinants of international economic relations. And finally, we also want to pay tribute to the life and work of Judge James Crawford, who has been an inspiration to many of us and has sadly passed away recently. The new format required quite a bit of rethinking on our part, but we trust that you will find your way around the SEAL 2021 platform. Most of the spaces, we hope, are self-explanatory. But let me just guide you through a few things. You can meet other participants in the coffee lounge on the left-hand side under the People heading. Visit exhibitors in the expo, create your own agenda, and meet poster presenters. The videos, we should say, of each event will be available on this platform for a couple of weeks, should you miss a session. And that goes without saying, these events will be recorded, so just be mindful of that if you don't want to appear. We will also post them on our YouTube site later this year. Finally, if you think you need help with anything, please visit the Live Help section at the bottom left of the screen. Before asking the Rector of Bocconi University to welcome you, we already wish to thank everyone at Bocconi University and in the SEAL Executive Council for their hard work in making this conference possible. An endless number of virtual meetings, calls, and email exchanges have brought us here today, and it has been a joy to work with all of you. We wish to thank in particular Professor Peter van den Bossche, who is the SIEL president, or rather our president. He has been a driving force of this conference. His commitment to making this conference, SIEL 2021, a success, and his enthusiasm, always coupled with good humor, have been inspiring. Peter, we're very grateful to have you as our president. And now we present the video of Bocconi's rector.
It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to Bocconi for the important conference that the Society of International Economic and Law has organized. Let me first of all thank the conference chairs, Professor van der Bossche, Professor Van Damme, Professor Wagner, and Professor Sacerdoti. As many of you may be aware, we should have met last year in 2020 in presence here at Bocconi University. Unfortunately, the world decided to stop for 1 year for the global lockdown that characterized most of our countries, and therefore we decided to postpone the conference. Luckily enough, digital instruments help us to deliver the conference, given that things are moving on, I would say, in a good way, but still, you know, it's very hard to travel, and it is very important to continue doing research, disseminate knowledge, and of course, for our students also continue studying. So thanks to digital technologies that give us the opportunity to continue also the conferences, we have decided to still organize the conference this year. It is my special pleasure to open this conference because Bocconi University is an interdisciplinary university focused on social sciences. Bocconi University has a School of Law, a School of Economics, a School of Business, a School of Political Science, and is more and more being invested in the field of data science and computer science. Therefore, the conference this year, whose title is particularly salient for this interdisciplinarity, which is rethinking global economic governance, is something that will for sure provide a boost to our overall participants, and I'm sure also to the professors that will attend, and as a consequence to all of our students. Of course, it would have been much better to meet in presence, but given the fact that things will move on, you know, in a good way, I'm sure that there will be many occasions in the future to still, you know, come to Milan and visit Bocconi University. We just opened a big wing of our campus, which is 90,000 square meters, so it's pretty big, and hosts every year more than 15,000 students, in addition to 1,000 professors and 600 administrative staff. So overall, despite, of course, the unpleasant situation to not physically meet, I'm sure that this conference will be as vibrant, as effective as, you know, being delivered in presence. And I wish all the presenters, all panelists, and of course, again, to the chair organizing this conference, good welcome, and more importantly, good luck for an effective conference. And again, I welcome you to Milan in the next months or years.
Thank you, Rector Verona, for these very kind words of introduction, and welcome to the SIEL audience. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say that I hope that we will have the chance to meet at Bocconi's campus at some point in the future. And it's now my pleasure to introduce to you Philippe de Baere, who will in turn introduce our first keynote event. Philippe, over to you.
Thank you, Markus. Thank you, Isabelle, and thank you, Peter van den Bossche. It's always a pleasure to attend the SIEL conference, and certainly one with such an impressive roster of speakers. I remember our former president, Gabriel Marceau, used to say, SIEL means heaven, and I will therefore continue to pronounce the SIEL acronym in the French way. I have been asked to briefly introduce the opening keynote event, during which Professor Giorgio Sacerdoti will interview Professor Mario Monti. It is no exaggeration to say that Mario Monti has played a key role in the history of Europe and Italy during the last 50 years. What is truly impressive is that he did so in so many different roles and fields. As an academic, as European Commissioner, as national politician. Moreover, in each of these roles, he has reached to the summit of the profession. After brilliant studies at Bocconi, our host university today, and at Yale, he started an impressive academic career. As professor of monetary theory and policy at Bocconi, he was first appointed director of the school's Institute of Economics, and then became rector in 1989. 5 years later, he was named president of Bocconi University, and he still holds this position today. In 1994, Mario Monti was chosen to serve as commissioner for the single market, financial services and tax policy in the European Commission headed by Jacques Santer. 5 years later, in 1999, he became one of the most powerful persons in Brussels when he was appointed European Commissioner for Competition in the Prodi Commission. As European Commissioner for Competition, Mario Monti became the driving force behind the first investigation of anti-competitive practices in the then still young digital economy, namely the landmark investigation of Microsoft and how Microsoft bundled its media player in its Microsoft Windows. This investigation opened the way for the current flurry of investigations against internet giants such as Google or Apple. Since our firm Van Bael and Bellis represented Microsoft in that investigation, it offered me a first-hand view on how Commissioner Monti managed to integrate the very complex legal and economic aspects into a workable solution. Not surprisingly, he was commonly referred to as Super Mario at that time. In the wake of the European sovereign debt crisis and after the turmoil of the Berlusconi years, Italy needed someone with precisely these skills. Mario Monti was therefore asked to lead the Italian government. He was sworn in as Prime Minister, as well as Minister of Economy and Finances of the Italian Republic in November 2011, a position he held until April 2013. Since then, Mario Monti has remained active as an influential thinker and opinion maker. It is our privilege to have Professor Monti with us today. Thank you.
So, dear friends of SIEL and participants to this annual conference, I'm pleased to participate to the keynote speech in the form of an interview to Professor Mario Monti, the president of Bocconi University. As you know, Professor Monti, dear Mario, has been twice a commissioner at the EU Commission in Brussels for the internal market, for antitrust, and then that was between 1995 and 2004, so at the beginning of the millennium, and then he was Prime Minister of Italy at the beginning of the next decade in 2011-2013. So his rich experience opens an interesting reflection, I think, on the world where we are heading to now in the 21st century, rethinking global economic governance, which is the title of our conference. So first of all, thank you, Mario, for having accepted to open the SIEL conference. Of course, we would have liked you to talk to the public as we had envisaged last year, but that was not possible. But at least we will have a lively online conference. So just to open the debate, what do you think are the major changes that you detect in the world economic and also the geopolitical underpinning of international relations, globalization, changes from when you were in Brussels and then you were in Rome in respect of the current situation and the current outlook?
Thank you very much, Giorgio. I'm really honored to see you all virtually, in most cases at Bocconi. As Rector Verona, underlined. It's a great privilege for us, and it is indeed a great pleasure and honor for me to take part with you, Professor Sacerdoti, dear Giorgio, in this opening keynote conversation. I think your event takes place at a particularly appropriate time because we are at the crossroad, I would say, of a medium long-term change and of a short-term change in the governance of globalization. Why do I say this? Because you mentioned the by now old days when I was Commissioner of the European Union, and since then the need for a coordinated global economic governance has become ever stronger. But that need was, I believe, never really met to the extent that it would have been necessary. And we in particular know that over the last 4 years, during the Trump administration, even the concept of governance of globalization, even the concept of multilateralism, and even the concept of coordination was dismissed largely. So we are at a special juncture when the worldwide events and with the important addition now of the pandemics, of which I'm sure we will talk later on, have made it clearer than ever that we do need to make a special effort to coordinate. And now the circumstances are politically much more favorable than just a few years ago. And I would say not only for the obvious change in the US administration from Mr. Trump to Mr. Biden, but also less glamorously for a change in the European Union. One of the paradoxes of European integration is that it tends to strengthen itself under crisis. Jean Monnet, the intellectual founder of the European community, used to say, Europe will be done through crisis, by crisis, and its shape will be the result, the cumulative result of the solutions that will have been given to those crises. And so unquestionably the pandemic crisis, which has shocked the world, was a drama initially, and of course humanly, but also from the political and economic point of view for the EU. But then under that huge crisis, the EU was able to find a new momentum, and indeed, much to the surprise of many, it was able last year to put together a huge package of relaunch and of structural reforms. So I would venture to say that the EU as a global player is now taken more seriously around the world than it was before its substantial reaction to the pandemic. So two of the main players of global governance are already positioned for it to make a step forward. Of course, China is itself a big player in globalization. Let's not forget that it has, alongside the EU, held the torch of the fight against climate change even during the years when President Trump denied that. At the same time, China, of course, is seen with a number of perplexities / big concerns by others. So I think the game of the next steps in globalization is particularly challenging, and I think that your initiative and the huge, how should I say, cumulative knowledge that your organization and the collection of the individuals mobilized by this organization brings can really be a player, beginning with this important conference and the stimuli it can give to policy and political players, to intellectuals, and to us students and teachers at the university like Bocconi.
Yes, thank you very much. I think this is a very good introductory reflection. Maybe the postponement of our conference for 1 year, which displeased us, makes the work that we are starting today for 3 days more relevant for the future, because there is a more broad perspective of what can be a new rethinking about globalization and its organization and multilateral cooperation, especially in the years to come. Of course, you mentioned the pandemic, the COVID crisis. And I know you have also specific knowledge on this, because last year you were appointed by the World Health Organization to chair a pan-European Commission on Health and Sustainable Development. And this is quite interesting, and maybe you could highlight a little bit what your commission is suggesting or has suggested. Of course, the COVID has been put the trade system on strain, because at the beginning we have seen restrictions, of course in traveling, in the movement of goods. We have seen restrictions on commerce of masks, on medical devices, and then thereafter, when the vaccines have started coming in, also restriction on the export of vaccine. Now, this has been hopefully maybe short term. There has been a reaction against this. There is also a campaign to provide vaccines to developing countries which don't have enough facilities. There is a discussion at the WTO going on as to relaxing of IP and transfer of technology in order to facilitate the production of vaccine in developing countries. I heard recently Madam Director General of the WTO was praising the role of the WTO, suggesting that the WTO was resilient in this moment and is offering a forum of cooperation and dialogue, although maybe I don't see yet practical results. So what is your reflection on also on the perspective, also this term of sustainable development that of course is nowadays so important?
Thank you for this question. Whenever I talk about public health and pandemics, of course I feel the need to justify myself, because I was very surprised, as you can imagine, when the WHO Director of the Regional Office for Europe in the terminology of WHO, by the way, is quite a big thing, because there are 53 member states comprising not just the EU, but the area embracing Russia, Kyrgyzstan, Turkey, down to Israel, etc. So it's a very diverse territory. And I told them, but look, I'm no virologist, I'm no medical doctor, what help can I give you? And they said, no, but we have many commissions on that. We want you and people that with you we will select to reflect not on the technical aspects of this issue, but on how the lesson of the pandemic will impact on and will have to impact on the policy trade-offs. So the rethinking of the priorities between health policy and all the other policies. Hence, we need somebody who has well, a broad economic experience and some political experience and knows how governments function and how the international community functions. So I took that on with enthusiasm. And in fact, in this 20 or so members commission, we have some former heads of states and governments, as well as some highly distinguished scientific experts. One obvious thing that came very clearly to our attention immediately has much to do with the topic of your conference, because the global governance of health, of public health, was totally inadequate to global health threats, even more so to one with such a pervasive and quick degree of international transmission like a pandemic. So, to give you just a bit of the flavor of the proposals we are coming up with, obviously everybody would agree that WHO needs, of course ours is an independent commission, even though it was convened by the WHO Europe. WHO needs to be reformed and strengthened in terms of its powers. For example, we are very familiar with the setup in the European Union. At least in some crucial areas, the EU and the Commission do have powers to ask questions of member states, to pretend answers, to make inspections, and to give guidelines for certain policies. Very little so for the WHO, as we have seen. Also, the structure of financing of the WHO is very, very uneven, unstable, and hugely debatable. So, okay, the WHO has to be the central piece of any reform to make the global governance of health more plausible and more effective. But that may not be enough. And we reflected a lot in our commission on the previous major global catastrophe, not like this one in terms of human tolls, but that was the big financial crisis of 2008, 2009, which had, if we think of it, which had broken another global public good. This time it was public health. That time it was financial stability. And financial stability with Lehman Brothers and all that was destroyed with enormous economic, financial, social, and political consequences after that. And how was the financial system restored from the point of view of more updated regulation, tighter supervision, etc., etc.? A very instrumental role was played by the G20, which set up a stable body within the G20 called the Financial Stability Board, which has existed since and which has produced a number of proposals of regulation and supervision, which through the IMF, through the central banks, through the national parliaments, are now governing the financial system and so far have prevented the repetition of that huge crisis. incidentally, the first chairman of the Financial Stability Board was the then governor of the Bank of Italy, Mario Draghi, who, as you know, this year chairs the overall G20 in the rotation.
Yes, because Italy is the chairman this year.
So our idea that we have put to the Global Health Summit in May and then to other fora is that alongside a reformed and more empowered WHO, there should be a G20 Global Health Board on the template with all the necessary variations of the Financial Stability Board. So a place where the health ministers and the finance ministers and their international bodies, the WHO, the IMF, should sit at a table and develop with the necessary coordination out of the light of the meetings of the heads of governments, proposals, then to go to the heads of governments. So, and this duplicates what we believe in our commission will be necessary at any rate in each country. That is, I mean, I have been Prime Minister for a short while. The way...
Well, not a short while. You were
well, 15 months or so, but very crucial because that was at the peak of the financial crisis. Otherwise, nobody would have thought of calling me to that job. But the health minister is not a central player of any council of ministers. The finance minister always has been. But now, of course, the health ministers and the health issues have taken the highest point of concern and of attention and of visibility. How can we keep on a permanent base this high degree of attention on public health that was obviously brought by this crisis? But suppose that next year there is a cyber security crisis or a nuclear crisis or some other major crisis. You know, the heads of governments are well-designed animals, normally unable to think, to concentrate and to focus on more than one issue at a time. So we
if you say so, you must you must know very well.
And I'm afraid this is on, you know, so we need to find a device to exploit this momentum of unparalleled attention on the public health issues and their coordination to crystallize this momentum and to make it hopefully permanent. Hence this idea of the Global Health Board, which I hope the Italian presidency will try to bring to fruition. Then, of course, there are so many other things also at the national level involving, for example, public finance. And here this again concerns the interaction between health ministers and finance ministers. We know the terrific cost, not only humanly, but also economically, that this pandemic has brought. Obviously, ex post, it would have been very largely paying itself to take some appropriate measures in advance, even very costly, to be able to reduce the knock-on effect of these pandemics, etc., if not to prevent it altogether. So we need a different modality of public finance accounting that would make place to, let's say, to annual precautionary allocations so that the probability of these occurrences is reduced, and this has a lot to do also with biodiversity, One Health, etc. And that, if anything, there is a global health major crisis, the system will have already, in part, economically accounted for that, so that there will not be such a brutal but necessary, out of improvisation, reaction that has derailed, because this is the word, fiscal policy, monetary policy,
also trade cooperation.
And trade, I was going to that. So we need to act, and this goes back to the governance of the fight against climate change, which has to do with more and more with health. But we need to prepare the global also economic and financial system to cope with the fallout of what we will not be able to prevent in a more orderly and well thought beforehand manner. Also to avoid, because you see this pandemic, and then I will stop, has shown us at the same time and very vividly that global governance was more needed than we ever thought. But also the pandemic made global governance in the short term more difficult than ever, and even within EU, as you hinted earlier.
Sure, because at the moment each country took protective measures which they thought was the best without looking at the neighbors, looking within the European Union. Even the Schengen freedom of movement has severely been affected for several months, and now the Commission has come back. Of course, I think what you say about the governance of the WHO is also interesting for the WTO and gives argument for reflection, because there too it's considered that the governance of the WTO, with its consensus, rigid consensus-based, open-ended committees, and so makes, let's say, the executive and legislative branch very weak in order to take decisions when needed, and there is prejudice against even plurilateral agreements or large mega-regional that could be a stepping stone to build globally, because countries fear to be cut off.
But here, I mean the WTO, we must switch interview, because of course you are the great expert. You have been for many years a crucial member of the WTO appellate body, which is in a lamentable state. So, if I may, I have two questions for you. One, do you see at least some artificial breathing possible to this crucial system, which is the enforcement in WTO, so the appellate body? And secondly, if the WTO, as I strongly hope, does survive and go on, is it ever thinkable that it may complement the action of the competition authorities around the world by having global agreements on subsidies or state aids, because as you hinted, I had quite a lot of experience in trying to create an harmonious system, and we succeeded to a large extent, of cooperation among the competition authorities. But take the US, the Justice Department, the Federal Trade Commission, so their antitrust authorities do not have the competences that the European Commission, as European competition authority, does have in terms of state aids to companies. But it would be highly auspicious for the WTO one day to be able to put in place a binding order in that area? Do you think it's totally unrealistic?
Well, this is one of the so-called Singapore issues that were raised at the end of the 90s when you were commissioner, but there was also investment to enlarge, there was enthusiasm for the WTO to enlarge its scope, but this has failed. And now I think the first priority, and Madam DG told it, said so in an interview she made to The Economist online a couple of days ago, that it is to revitalize the current function and the current mechanism of supervision, enforcement, and decision-making by the WTO. So I think the experience, if the WHO is successful in reshuffling its governance, could be also an example for the WTO. So you came on the current status of the governance of the global economy. International economic relations are moving, and as we know, a few months ago in February, the EU Commission may propose a communication on a trade policy review entitled An Open, Sustainable and Assertive Trade Policy. So the Commission in this new framework would like to relaunch the role of the EU as a global player, one of the major global player in trade relations. And there is also an appendix on revitalizing the WTO. The EU is a staunch supporter, of course, of multilateralism. Now, how do we view this? The foreign trade, the commerce, is one of the functions like antitrust in which the European Union has exclusive powers and the Commission has important powers. Differently, for instance, in taxation, maybe we'll come to this hot issue afterwards. Now it's said, of course, the EU is a major market, an important import and export. Regulation by the EU often sets global standards, even for industry, even beyond the legal, that they are legal, compulsory or not. On the other hand, this soft power is soft, and the European Union often is divided within itself and is not always able to project these desires and this standard and so on the global arena and finds competition. Now we have a framework, of course, in which between US and China there is an enhanced competition, not always so friendly, even after the Trump administration. How do you see a possible role of the EU currently in the field of setting, maintaining multilateralism, open trade, but also regulation that takes into account, of course, the new goals? This is the greening of the economy, the decarbonization, the equilibrium in emissions, climate change, and also labor rights, human rights, and non-trade issues which go with sustainable development goals.
Not an easy question, Professor. I must say that for the EU, as you hinted, multilateralism is a structural feature, because the multilateral approach to problems, coordination, and in some cases that you mentioned, even centralized decision by the Commission is in the DNA of the European Union. So I would say that the US, not to speak of China, are more likely to have cycles on their love or hate or concern or skepticism on multilateral. Not the EU. Ideologically, it cannot have questions on...
Although once upon a time there were speeches about Fortress Europe, I remember, with the Delors plan in '92, the US accusing Europe to favor inside.
But that speech was never spoken in Europe. It was spoken in Washington and above all in Tokyo. At that time, Beijing was not a player in the global economy. Exactly, because they were concerned that the European project of setting up a single market, an internal market as it was called, would be the first step towards building a fortress Europe. By the way, since I've always been convinced that words matter a lot, when I became actually in 1995 commissioner for the internal market, which was still in the stage of being implemented, I never used the official terminology internal market, but I used single market for two reasons, as I explained. One, that to the Europeans, single market, differently from internal markets, conveys a concept of will. So the market was not single by nature. On the contrary, there were divided national markets. So we had to make it single. So single as a stronger word than internal in terms of voluntarism. Also, I was afraid, seeing the reactions in Washington and Tokyo, that the adjective internal might indeed feed the concern, almost a legitimate concern, that it would be a fortress. Because if you call it internal, it gives the sense that it might be closed to the outside world. So, and I think these huge concerns that the US and Japan had have been largely dispelled, not by my terminological efforts, but by history, by experience, because they have seen. You remember the great disputes on whether a regional integration is a building block or a stumbling block vis-à-vis global integration. I've always been convinced that it could be, under certain conditions, a building block. And I believe this has been the case. But I have always also been convinced that if we want Europe, the European public opinion, European politicians, European trade unions, and European business leaders to stay on board the notion of openness, we need to show that when it is strictly necessary, we are not necessarily the most naive in the world. That's why in 2010, I was no longer commissioner and not yet prime minister. President Barroso of the European Commission asked me to prepare for him a report on how to make the most of the single market for Europe's economy and society. On this issue, I came up with a very simple expression: the single market open but not disarmed. So it needs to have instruments that under normal conditions make it open to all EU and non-EU players. But if a company is heavily subsidized in its own country and comes in the EU to take part in public bids for national or local administrations, there must be a system that allows the European competitors not to see the price offered by Chinese or American or whatever company undercut because of the deep pockets of the state to which that company belongs. By the way, this could occur even within the EU, but we do have the system of state aid control to prevent that.
In fact, there is a new revision of the EU regulation on subsidies that could prevent foreign companies to bid domestically if they have the favor of this deep pocket, as you mentioned.
If we have to keep consensus on a EU, which is the result, after all, or 500 million citizens and electors, if we want to keep this consensus for an open world, beginning with an open Europe, we need not to be too naive.
So this definition of this new policy as an open strategic autonomy of the EU reflects, I think, this concept that you are explaining now.
But of course, strategy is a very seductive concept which can embrace almost everything. To give you one example, if I may, the issue of European industrial champions. I never had anything against them. If there are national champions in, let's say, France or Germany or Italy, okay, but as Europeans, if we want European integration, we should encourage European champions through cross-border mergers and acquisitions within the EU. Many times, as you know, national governments, even though preaching the virtues of European champions, have erected explicit or hidden obstacles to cross-border mergers within the EU. But I am all for the European economy to be willing and able to come through mergers and acquisitions and internal growth to European champions, which is a strategic concept. Was I, when I was competition commissioner, and would I now be intellectually in favor of European champions constructed a bit artificially by bending the rules on competition policy and merger control in order to favor the emergence of European champions? I would not be in favor of that, and not because of purism or intellectual love for liberalism, not necessarily. But take a case, and we had a big one a couple of years ago, of a huge German group and a huge French group in the railway building.
Which was opposed by Mrs. Vestager, I think.
Yes, so a Siemens-Alstom combination. I was not there, I've not made the analysis, but the deep analysis published showed that in a number of cases only substantial remedies, so divestitures would have made that giant compatible with the interest of consumers in the European economy. If that was the case, should we have been in favor of tilting a bit the rules from competition policy side in order to have this big European champion?
In a world scene.
I'm afraid it would not have been helpful relative to the very objective of this, because such a giant, if created, especially if created with the smiling complicity of the European Competition Authority, would have been created with the aim of really becoming a global player. So it would have needed the merger control authorization, also not just by Brussels, but also by Washington, Tokyo, Beijing, etc. Would their antitrust authorities have been supposed to play the same deference to a European champion? Probably not. And what would have happened if this newly blessed European champion were not authorized, say, in Washington?
Like you did not authorize in Brussels
Exactly,
a merger
exactly.
of
We
Google in Washington.
We do not need great imagination. There are historical examples. In 2002, as I see you remember, the largest company in the world at the time, General Electric, had acquired control of Honeywell. The American antitrust authorities had immediately cleared with very minor concessions that transaction. Mr. Welch, the CEO of GE, came to Brussels. We discussed that several months. We were not convinced that that would have not harmed seriously the European but also global market for regional aircrafts and for a number of avionic devices. So we did not authorize that merger. What would have been the implication if GE and Honeywell insisted on actually consummating their marriage, their wedding? That they could not have sold aircrafts and black boxes, avionic equipments in the whole of the European market. So the economics of that merger would have been disrupted, and they decided as a consequence not to implement the merger even in the US.
So we go back to the cooperation between antitrust authorities, and you think they should be in effect independent and not be bended in each country for the need of this global industrial policy of each country competing with others.
It would be a short-lived attempt to play strategic supremacy. On the other hand, it is hugely important for all the CEOs of the world to have a rather harmonious system of competition authorities. Otherwise, when they plan a big merger and they have to notify that plan to 100 competition authorities around the globe, imagine if they are faced with totally disparate criteria. It's a mess.
Let's go to something different but related, on which you have also expressed your views in the past, also recently. The question of taxing the digital giants, tax haven run to the bottom, the various European countries, and also maybe at the European level where there is not such a competence and unanimity is required. There were the question of Ireland, Google, the low taxation. We have tax haven even within the EU. And now here comes Mr. Yellen, the Federal Reserve, and the Treasury in the US, and the Biden administration proposing a global minimum tax. How do you view this new frontier of international cooperation, but maybe also of international disharmony? And here one would need also certain small countries which are specialized in tax haven. And OECD recently has had a long battle on exchange of information, transparency, and so on.
You said it all yourself, Giorgio, because I think, well, I personally welcome the agreement reached at the G7 at the initiative of the Biden administration with the support of the EU about this global minimum corporate tax. I believe it is more advanced, more clean and clear than a specific tax on the digital. But we needed something of this sort also because I would not taken for granted that the capitalist economic system will always be accepted by everybody, even though there is not now a competitor as strong as communism and central planning was before the fall of the Berlin Wall. So we need to have a minimum, and if possible, more than a minimum of social consensus on the system. How can we have social consensus if companies, big companies, are able to play the openness of the global system or of the European system to introduce systematically a bias because of a lack of tax coordination, a bias in favor of a low and lower and lower and lower taxation of companies, the balance being made by governments through a higher and higher taxation of labor. This is not really acceptable. So this proposal, I personally welcome it very much. It, at the same time, puts the EU in an interesting and difficult situation because the EU as such can accept a deal with the US and others in the OECD, etc. But to make it legally binding within the EU itself, it has to translate it into a EU directive or regulation. Whatever the instrument that will have, because it covers the issue of taxation under our treaty, that would have, in order to be accepted and enforceable in the EU, to be accepted by each individual member state.
Unanimity is needed.
Among the 27.
So maybe this could be one of those crises, external pressure that would advance the unity of the EU.
That's a very good point, because in our national countries in the EU, many times, after all, after many complaints and grumblings, we have made progress under the external constraint of the EU. Here...
Of the US sometimes, yeah.
No, of the EU,
EU.
in our national countries.
Yes.
You know, how many times in Italy or elsewhere certain politically costly reforms took place, after all, because the local politicians...
Brussels said
exactly. In this case, it would be the EU to use the external pressure argument by the US and the rest of the G7 on some of its member states, the more recalcitrant to this system.
Well, yes, that's very interesting, and we are coming almost to the end. And I think asking you a final question, which goes more to the academic, to the public of students and young scholars and researchers we have here at SIEL at our conference. Bocconi it's an Italian university, wants to become a global university. There is a global market of education with universities competing to attract the most talented students around the world without limits of nationality. How do you see this perspective now for university like Bocconi or others, and the perspective for scholars or students or graduate students or PhD candidates that look around the world where they can best get teaching and good formation for their future careers?
Well, this is a case, the teaching activity and the research activity is a case where I believe at the same time in cooperation and competition, even strong competition. We have, as Bocconi, but other universities have many other important cases of networks, cooperation agreements, etc., dual degrees and all that, that needs only to be encouraged. And at the same time, I think competition is a key word here too. Maybe because I've been spending a part of my life trying to enforce competition, but here I also like competition among universities for these principles, maybe also because our university does not come out badly at all. If we look, this is not promotion, because we could and must and will do better. But if we look at the rankings on the quality of research on the basis of a number of indicators, the rankings published by QS, that for research is the most accredited source, in the last few years in our areas, that is economics, law, management and political science, we are being ranked 4th in Europe and 11th in the world. May I note that the 3 who do better than us in Europe are UK universities, Cambridge, Oxford, and the London School of Economics. So after Brexit, without any special effort from our side, we have become in these rankings the 1st in the EU, but and 11th in the world. But it's very vital to instill in the whole system of governance of a university the principles of competition, of serious competition, of genuine and loyal competition, and at the same time of cooperation. We believe, I personally believe that it's not obvious that an Italian university in this area of subjects can compete so well globally. I think it's great news, not only for us, but also because here at Bocconi we try to shape human capital for the whole of the EU and beyond. We have students at the various levels from 99, I guess, the last figure, of different nationalities. And we once, at the beginning of our existence in 1902, Bocconi created much of the managerial class for the Milanese and Lombard economy now.
Now it's for the world.
And now it's for the world. And I mean, when a professor like you, faculty member from Bocconi, becomes a member of the appellate body of WTO, with the hope that you are not one of the last ever in that body. We are proud, and that helps, and so many other cases, that helps bring to our students more lively and updated teaching, and also this builds connections that, for example, allow Bocconi these days
to have competed and obtained that SIEL
exactly.
when 2021 would take place
exactly.
here.
So,
we competed with other universities.
So thank you so much, all participants and all leaders of SIEL, for having chosen Bocconi, persisted in your choice, even though it was not lucky last year. And to you, Giorgio, thank you so much for bringing light to our university.
Thank you very much. So this keynote opening has been concluded, and we look forward after a short pause to have you all follow our roundtables, keynote speeches, panels that will follow in the next 2 days. Thank you very much. And thank you to you, Mario, for your kindness and availability.